Hello, it's July 4th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have journalist and reporter Nick McAlpin.
Hello.
And journalist and reporter Rosabel Crean.
Hello.
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of the news. On with the show. It's a big day for the UK, Nick. What's going on?
Well, as you so kindly said in the introduction, it's Thursday, July the 4th, and today the UK is at the polls in a general election. It's widely expected that Labour will secure a majority of parliamentary seats and form the next government, making party leader Sir Keir Starmer the country's next Prime Minister. Labour has been in opposition since 2010. For some voters participating in this election, particularly Muslims and young people, Palestine is a major issue. But the question remains, will this segment of the population be large enough to shift the results in any of the UK's 650 constituencies? Here's what Keir Starmer, the man likely to be Britain's next Prime Minister, had to say at a campaign event in Redditch, England on Wednesday, the day before the vote.
We stand here on the eve of the election as a changed Labour Party. A Labour Party that has pushed protest to one side, has returned our party to the service of working people and proudly says, country first, party second.
Nick, you mentioned how there's a lot of issues around particularly for Muslim voters in the UK. Obviously, I think at the top of the pile for many is the war in Gaza, and then maybe more specifically the UK's involvement and support for that war in Gaza. Is that, would we say, the biggest issue for voters?
No. I guess it depends which voters you're talking about. Of course, for some individuals that would be the biggest issue, but we've had some polling data. So there was a survey by Survation that showed 44% of Muslim adults considered the, quote, Israel-Palestine conflict a top 5 concern at the election.
That's quite a lot.
44% considering a top 5 concern, but again, that's not a majority. And of that 44%, 86% said they would consider backing a pro-Palestinian independent candidate standing on the issue. For the general population, the Israel-Palestine conflict was a top 5 policy priority for a much lower 12% of voters. So it's clearly an issue for Muslims in particular, but also young people. Yeah, where we had a quarter of 18 to 24-year-olds ranking the issue as a top 3 policy concern. Considering
that the UK is facing a lot of challenges at the moment, financial challenges, energy challenges, etc., the NHS, a quarter is quite a big number, I would have thought, for young people to be concerned about. Let's be honest, foreign issues. Yeah, I would say. I mean, it's a moral stance on their part.
Certainly, and yeah, so within the top 3 issues, a quarter of 18 to 24-year-olds, I think you're right, that is a significant number. Obviously, there is the issue with young people and not voting. That's one thing. Will they actually turn out in the end?
What have the main parties been saying about the war in Gaza? Has it come up, in their stump speeches at all? Have they been saying what, they would want to do going forward in their campaigns?
I wouldn't say it's an issue that's dominated the election in terms of messaging from the 2 main political parties, Labour and the Conservatives. The Workers' Party of Britain, which is a smaller leftist party led by George Galloway, has made Palestine a major focus at this election. But in terms of Labour and the Conservatives, no, it's not been a major central issue. But it is interesting, if you look at the Labour Party's manifesto, Labour has pledged to recognise a Palestinian state. It's likely an effort to stem anger among voters who care deeply about Palestine and Gaza as issues. But it must be said that this pledge appears to be softer than what was offered under former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who's now running as an independent in this election.
On the subject of independence, there are quite a few. I think maybe perhaps a record number of independents standing this time round. And there are a number who are running on sort of a Palestine/Gaza-centric platform. Who are some of the bigger names who are standing on that sort of platform, and have they actually managed to, we have a fairly strong two-party system in the UK. Have they managed to break through at all locally?
Well, it's interesting. So just to kind of take a step back a little bit, in terms of pro-Palestinian candidates running outside of the two main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, I think it's useful to look at it in terms of a few categories. So you have independents, as you mentioned. You have candidates that's running for the Workers' Party of Britain, and you have candidates for the Greens as well. I think those are kind of the broad divisions there. But there are also other elements to look at. So there are candidates for whom Gaza is an issue, but it's not a defining one. So give an example there of Green Party co-leader Carla Denyer hoping to unseat Labour frontbencher Thangam Debonair in Bristol Central, as well as Jeremy Corbyn, as I mentioned, running now as an independent in Islington North. So there's that as well. And then I think you also do have candidates for whom Gaza is a defining issue. And probably most notable among them is Liam Mohammed, who's a British Palestinian activist hoping to unseat Labour frontbencher Wes Streeting in the London seat of Ilford North.
Are any of these people going to win? I mean, as we're speaking, the polls are still open in the UK. By the time you hear this, they would have closed.
Yeah,
do we
10
think,
p.m. tonight.
10 p.m. tonight. Do we think that any of them would have broken through?
I think it's hard to say, but I recently interviewed Emma Levin, the associate director at the polling firm Savanta. And from that conversation, it seems the issue of Palestine and Israel may not cost Labour seats now, though it could be a thorn in their side going forward if the party forms the next government, with a small but significant proportion of people potentially questioning the party's stance. Having said that, there has been some discussion online, and I've heard from one person that I regard as knowledgeable that the constituency of Birmingham Perrybar in central England is one to watch. There you have the independent candidate Ayub Khan, who's running against Labour's Khalid Mahmoud. And there's a potential there, if what I'm hearing is correct, that Mahmoud could be unseated, and that you could have an independent there. Will that materialise? I don't know, but that should be one to watch.
Watch this space. I mean, if polling is to be believed, we are on course for a major sort of Labour landslide, and they're going to end up with a massive majority in Parliament. If they do get in, do we know what their plans for, their foreign policy plans for the Middle East are? Have they said anything?
Well, we mentioned the pledge to recognise a Palestinian state, but I think what's most interesting to me is if you open the Labour manifesto, they have a section, Britain Reconnected, and there's some bullet points at the top. And I'll read a couple of them. So it says there's an unshakable commitment to NATO and our nuclear deterrent, standing up for our armed forces and veterans, new trade agreements, Britain leading a clean power alliance, and modernise international development.
Great. That's all incredibly vague.
Well, I mean, there's more detail if you go through and read the specifics on what they're pledging.
I suppose it highlights how elections here, foreign policy is always at the bottom of the list, really.
It is, isn't it?
I mean, for voters and for the parties.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, as I said, if you those are the bullet points at the top, you can go down and read more. The Middle East is mentioned, so there's a bit here that says, war has returned to Europe for the first time in a generation. There is devastating violence in the Middle East, rapid technological change, and the climate crisis are fueling geopolitical tensions, and malign actors are seeking to divide us. That's kind of a blurb bit in there.
Okay.
And it also says that long-term peace and security in the Middle East will be an immediate focus, and Labour will continue to push for an immediate ceasefire and so on. That they've kind of, mentioned the release of hostages, upholding international law, and the boosting of aid into Gaza.
Let's hope that happens. Rosabel, you had a question.
Yes, I wanted to thinking about the election in more of a global picture. We've seen many elections around the world this year. Recently with the European Parliament, and currently ongoing is the French election, where we're seeing the sort of the right-wing parties take hold. So I thought, how come we're seeing in the UK essentially what's seeming a rejection of the traditional right, being the Conservative Party, and a move towards Labour after 14 years? Why do we think that's happening as such?
Well, I think, in brief, the UK's traditional right-wing party, as you said, the Conservatives, has been in power for so long, 14 years. It's hard for them to make an argument to voters. They've also had a difficult few years politically, changes of Prime Minister, economic turmoil, global issues, coronavirus, and so on. And that said, while that traditional right-wing party is having a difficult time, Reform UK, which I mentioned, is challenging the Conservatives from the right and seeing some success there. But the UK uses an electoral system known as first past the post, where the candidate with the highest number of votes locally becomes the MP for that area. So that means it'd be very hard for Reform to win a large number of seats, even though they've got a pretty strong vote share.
I think it's about
17% when you look at an average of the polls. Yeah.
So it's getting 17% of the vote, but I think they're sort of aiming, or it's expected they're going to get around sort of 6 or 7 seats, which is less than 1% of Parliament.
Right.
And Conservatives about 22%.
Yeah.
21% according to the BBC poll tracker as of yesterday for Conservatives, 21, Reform 17. So there's not a huge gap between them. The Conservatives are likely to suffer huge losses, but to still have many multiples of times more seats than Reform, despite the fact that they're actually pretty close in terms of vote share if you look at the polls. So it may be the case that after this election there's renewed concern from some area or renewed push from some areas of politics for a change in the voting system.
We will wait and see. Second story this week, that's you, Rosabel. You've been looking at the Taliban.
Indeed. So for the first time since the Taliban took over Afghanistan in 2021, they sat down at the table with UN officials and various envoys from across the world, holding meetings in Qatar. The meetings were to engage with representatives of these ultra-conservative and religious faction and militant group known as the Taliban, mainly to discuss how the international community moving forward can approach the de facto rulers, including various deep issues within the country like their economic collapse, the drug industry, and noticeably women's rights. So the opening sessions were last weekend on 30th June and 1st July in Doha, and we saw about 20 special envoys assembled from the likes of Canada, the UK, US, France, the EU, and so on, and UN officials who organised the meetings. No country has recognised the Taliban authorities since they came to power, and the UN emphasised that even though this meeting was taking place, it did not qualify as a recognition. And that was sort of one of quite a few controversies surrounding the meeting. Most noticeably was the absence of women from any of the talks. The Taliban's government spokesperson, Zabihullah Mujahid, said, "These issues, women's rights, are Afghanistan's issues. We are working to find a logical path towards solutions inside Afghanistan so that, God forbid, our country doesn't fall again into discord and war, as well as to find a solution for these issues to fulfill the needs and requirements in the framework of the environment for women guided by Islamic Sharia."
Rosabel, these talks, what's been on the table here? What have they actually been? What were they trying to achieve with these? I'm guessing it wasn't just a general catch-up and chit-chat.
Yes, it was not a general catch-up and chit-chat. It was actually the third meeting that the UN have held, but only the first one the Taliban have attended, as I said. It was essentially to open up dialogue with the group. The international community, noticeably the West, are concerned about various issues, including women's rights, notably their exclusion from public life, such as education, employment, and so on, and the concern about the illegal drugs trade, which includes opium, notoriously, which has been going on for decades. And in particular, I think that the international community are concerned about what other actors might fill the void in terms of their pariah. In other words, the likes of Russia and China coming in to make friends with the Taliban before essentially the UN and the West have sat down with them.
You mentioned, that they've previously snubbed these meetings with the UN. What's changed? Why they turned up this time?
So this time they accepted the invitation, mainly because they insisted that women had to be excluded, and civil society actors and NGO representatives also had to be excluded. The UN said this was essentially a price worth paying to open up a dialogue. The Taliban saw it as a win-win. Their demands were met, women were excluded, and they got to sit down at the table, which gave them a sort of great PR image in terms of engaging with other countries.
As you say, women weren't invited to this. Why do we think that the UN chose to, in a term, concede to the Taliban? And what did the critics of that decision have to say? And how did the hosts and the planners, namely the UN, defend this exclusion? I mean, you say they thought it was a price worth paying. Is that all they're getting from this?
So the Taliban said they wouldn't sit at the table if women or civil society actors were invited, saying that they are the ultimate authority in Afghanistan and therefore it should only be them involved in the talks. This was heavily criticised from human rights groups.
Fair enough.
And Afghan women themselves. Heather Barr from Human Rights Watch said, "What is happening in Afghanistan is the most serious women's rights crisis in the world, and the idea that the UN would convene a meeting like this and not discuss women's rights and not have Afghan women in the room is beyond belief. The only plausible explanation is they're doing this to get the Taliban to the table, but for what?" So she is sort of speaking for quite a lot of people there. Another noticeable voice was Malala Yousafzai, who's the famous 27-year-old Pakistani who was shot by Taliban gunmen in Pakistan for campaigning for girls' education and developed to become a global figurehead. She said that she had spoken to the UN Secretary General about the Doha meeting and expressed her disappointment and alarm that women's rights defenders were excluded from the main conversation, and it sent all the wrong signals.
I mean, you say here that Heather Barr of Human Rights Watch said that the Taliban are at the table, but for what? That's a pretty good question. I mean, the Taliban have said that the West should, as a quote, look past the measures they have imposed on Afghan women and girls for the sake of foreign relations. But, what can the West get out of a relationship with the Taliban? What's in it for them? Why bother?
I suppose their response would be it's better to have dialogue than not, because as I mentioned earlier about who might fill that vacuum, which could exacerbate Western concerns even more. I think also in terms of a big issue such as women's education, that's something that the Taliban have said that women's rights in the country are sort of put under the framework of Sharia law, and that's something that will be discussed within the country itself, and that they've repeatedly said that the rights of all citizens are guaranteed under Islamic law. But in terms of defence, the UN Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Rosabel Crean, who was at the meeting, explained that the UN faced, quote, a very tough, maybe impossible choice, aiming to bring the Taliban together with the special envoys. She said, regrettably, the de facto authorities will not sit across the table with Afghan civil society in this format, but they heard very clearly the need to include women and civil society in all aspects of public life. But I know that answer isn't really enough for Afghan women themselves, who have also expressed disappointment at the meeting. One woman, Fawzia Kufi, who's a well-known politician and women's rights activist and was the first vice president of the Afghan parliament, wrote in The Guardian just last week that, Afghans are now questioning the international community's commitment to women's rights when their own fundamental rights were so easily bartered in exchange for geopolitical convenience during the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So I guess for a lot of Afghans, perhaps it sort of adds to what is a long list of disappointments in terms of how the West have dealt with Afghanistan and the Taliban.
Yeah. Nick, you had a question.
So we talked a lot about the kind of political level. Can you talk to us about the international efforts that are being made to ensure representation of Afghan women in other walks of life?
Yes, interestingly, at the upcoming Olympics in Paris, we will see an Afghanistan team there, not represented under the Taliban authority as such, but a group of six, 3 women and 3 men, which was sort of orchestrated by the International Olympic Committee over the last few years, the IOC, the Afghanistan's National Olympic Committee, who are currently in exile, have essentially organised to ensure that these athletes will be able to compete despite the Taliban's status in the country. We're going to see the women in athletics and cycling and the men in swimming and judo as well as athletics.
But they won't be competing under the Taliban flag?
No, it will be them competing in exile.
Okay.
Another interesting area is the work of Afghan female journalists, many of whom had to flee when the Taliban came to power, which is nearly 3 years in August, actually. One of whom is Zahra Joya, who founded the country's first feminist news agency called Rukshana Media, and she currently runs it in the UK. And she has a very interesting story and has pushed to keep up the news agency and employs writers from within Afghanistan, many women who are reporting at great risk to their own safety to ensure that their voices are still being heard, and voices of men as well, who are as well facing oppression in different aspects under the Taliban regime.
Incredibly brave. Final story from me this week. Authorities in Turkey detained dozens of people following riots in several cities. Violent mobs were sparked following accusations that a Syrian man had harassed a child. Syrian businesses and properties were targeted, with one grocery store being set on fire.
Violent mobs sounds pretty bad. What happened?
So this all started in the city of Kayseri. It's in the Turkish Anatolian heartland. This was on Sunday, June 30th. There were reports of a Syrian national allegedly sexually harassing an underage girl. This spread pretty quickly, this allegation, particularly on social media. Hundreds of locals then came out and protested. They destroyed vehicles and stores that belonged to Syrians. They set buildings ablaze. One local observer described it as a, quote, an attempted pogrom. Footage that was filmed of the attacks on Syrians was then posted on social media, which received a lot of applause on social media. In one of the videos that was posted, there was a Turkish man who was heard shouting, "We don't, quote, we don't want any more Syrians, we don't want any more foreigners." There's a sentiment sort of heard in a number of different videos posted online. The Turkish fascist Grey Wolves, who are a pretty nasty group, they were mobilizing in Hatay, which is near the Syrian border, also attacking local Syrian shops, and then surrounding the region's municipal building, chanting, "We don't want refugees." In Adana, Turkish police had to scramble to stop a racist Turkish motorbike gang from entering Syrian neighborhoods. This is really quite bad, and it's some of the worst. Turkey has seen anti-Syrian violence before and anti-Syrian protests. This has been some of the worst anti-Syrian violence seen in the country. For some context, Turkey hosts around 4 million refugees, of which 3.6 million are Syrians. In recent years, with economic problems, they've often been scapegoated as responsible for the country's economic problems.
And the violence came about after an online allegation. What do we know about the allegation? Is there any truth to it?
Well, maybe. I mean, maybe not. There appears to be enough sort of credence to the allegations for the authorities to make an arrest. This was in the Melik Gazi region of Kayseri province. The young girl victim, along with her siblings and her mother, were also placed in protective state custody. Whether the allegations are true or not, that's up for the courts to decide, really. What this case has done is it's just essentially been used as a springboard for just general anti-Syrian sentiment within Turkey, fueled online mainly. The Turkish Interior Minister, he said that following the incident, 343,000 anti-Syrian posts were made from just 79,000 accounts on X. The security agencies then determined that 37% of those were from bots. So that really sort of questions the validity of any of the sort of statements being made online about whether they're true or not, if they're all being made by bots. 68% of these sort of fake accounts were making provocative comments about Syrians. The Turkish government, they've said they don't know where these bots are originating from, but they are investigating to see if they're sort of linked to efforts to sow wider chaos in Turkey. Essentially, anti-Syrian parties which exist in Turkey have really grabbed hold of this very quickly and have used it to support their own ideologies.
You talked a little bit about this already, but how did the authorities respond to the attacks?
The provincial police chief of Kayseri, he was seen addressing a very angry crowd from a balcony. He's promised that the state had, quote, received the message and pledged to visit the neighbourhood weekly to ensure safety. A Turkish journalist noted that the police chief also felt it necessary to say that the child who had been attacked wasn't Turkish. The Kayseri's chief public prosecutor's office launched an investigation. 9 people from the suspect and victims' families have been sent to deportation centres. I'm not entirely sure why the victims' families were included in that, but that is what happened.
Or indeed the alleged perpetrators' families. It wouldn't be their fault.
Yes, yeah, that is very true. At the top of the Turkish tree, the Interior Minister on Monday, he said that citizens had acted illegally with these riots, that they did not suit, quote, our human values. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Monday, he blamed the opposition for stoking the tensions and condemned the anti-Syrian violence, saying it was unacceptable.
And there haven't only been protests in Turkey itself, right? There were protests in Syria, which were related or not related?
Both. So the following afternoon, after the protests in Turkey, multiple protests took place in multiple cities across northern Syria. They were attacking cars and trucks that had Turkish number plates. There was some footage that showed Turkish armed vehicles and some Turkish outposts that had been fired at in Afrin and Azaz. On Telegram, the messaging app, there was calls for an escalation of attacks against Turkish bases in Idlib. For those of you who are not sort of in the loop, within Syria, obviously had the Syrian civil war. Today, Turkish forces control much of the northern parts of Syria, and the Syrian people within northern Syria live under Turkish control. There was video that was posted during one of these protests of a Syrian man saying to a Turkish soldier, quote, "You're selling us to Bashar al-Assad. Do you want to sell us to the PKK?" A reference to a Kurdish group. This sort of points to the other side of this, which is there is an intense anger amongst Syrians in these Turkish-controlled areas currently for the anti-Syrian protests we saw in Turkey, but also because last Wednesday, Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, announced that he was open to holding talks with Turkey. Now, this has happened before. He said that they'll have talks with Turkey before, who are not engaged in relations at the moment. Previously, though, it was always sort of these notions of talks came with sort of maximalist preconditions, saying we will engage in talks with you on the precondition that all Turkish forces leave Syrian lands. This time there was no such preconditions, which was a development. The Turkish government had always rejected those preconditions. They've always said, the Turkish government, they said that everything could be discussed, but without any preconditions. Assad was made these comments to the Russian president's special envoy to Syria. He said, quote, "Syria is open to all initiatives regarding Syrian-Turkish relations as long as they are based on respect for the sovereignty of the Syrian state over all its territory and the fight against all forms of terrorism and its organizations." Assad sort of backing away from these maximalist preconditions all come after Iraqi mediation efforts led by the Prime Minister of Iraq, Mohammed Shia Soudani, who sort of convinced the Syrian government to engage with Turkey. You know, Erdogan has previously called Assad both a butcher and a dictator. He is now saying, "There is no reason not to establish ties with Syria. We may act together in the same way we did in the past." He said that on Friday. He also said, "And we have no interest in interfering in Syrian internal affairs. We may even sit and talk with each other, even to the point of coming together with families." The general notion is that at this time, Ankara, the Turkish government, believes now is the time for talks with Damascus. This will help essentially to facilitate the eventual return of refugees in Syria. It can also, their idea is, help establish a sort of joint alliance, military alliance generally, against Kurdish armed groups in eastern Syria. In northern Syria, you have Turkish forces. In northeastern Syria, you have the likes of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who are a Kurdish group who are in opposition to Turkey and the Syrian regime. Sort of to prove Erdogan's point of, wanting to do something, Turkey reopened the Abu al-Zadin crossing that connects Turkish-controlled areas to areas controlled by the Syrian government, which angered a lot of Syrians living in Turkish areas, who then stormed the crossing, destroyed some of the equipment, and called on local authorities to stop doing this.
So you've talked a lot about the potential for talks, but at the end of the day, will Turkey and the Syrian regime normalise ties?
Maybe. It is, the road to that point is long. It is really quite long. What I would say is the region is generally moving in that sort of direction when it comes to Bashar al-Assad. The Arab League, you may recall, readmitted Assad. He had his photo taken with Mohammed bin Salman. Opening up sort of relations and getting trade going with Syria would bring in money for Turkey. Turkey desperately needs money. The economy is in a bad state. Erdogan is looking down the barrel of electoral defeat at the next presidential election. That seems to be where things are going in Turkey. Returning Syrians en masse to Syria could be a really good vote winner for him. As we've seen with these other protests, there are constituents in Turkey who do not like Syrians, and they do not like Syrians in Turkey. Returning Syrians back to Syria could be a good vote winner. I think one thing that would be interesting, Erdogan is an expert when it comes to balancing between East and West, and particularly with the likes of staying friendlies with Russia and Iran while also staying friendly with Western nations. It will be interesting to see whether normalising with Assad will be too much for Western leaders. I imagine they would probably get over it. Especially
because the Arab League, the situation there, so that makes it a bit harder for
Western
there to be an objection.
Yeah. But as I said, the path to that is really looking quite long. A few other stories have been out this week. One here, this was today actually, it was quite a development. Hezbollah rains rockets on Israel after commander killed. Lebanon's Hezbollah said it launched more than 200 rockets and explosive drones at Israeli military positions on Thursday, today as tensions have soared amid the almost 9 months old war raging in Gaza. Do we think that maybe Hezbollah are overplaying their hand a bit? Do they have more than they think they have, or are Israel going to lash out, do we think?
It seems a bit of a repeated cycle, right? We've seen lots of similar stories of escalations, and then thankfully that hasn't led to a full-out war. But the danger is when you keep seeing escalation after escalation, repeat after repeat, it only takes that one time for it to accidentally go too far on the part of either side, and you're in that situation, and then what do? It's very hard to get out of it once you end up there. So I really hope that this doesn't develop any further than it has already.
Yeah, I agree. Khamenei urges turnout after voters shun presidential round. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei called Wednesday for voters to participate in Friday's presidential ballot, saying that historically low first round turnout was not an act against the system. Khamenei wants people to vote. Will anybody listen?
I found this a surprising admission of a seemingly low turnout from Khamenei. It seems quite unusual in that sense.
Only 40%.
Yeah, and it's quite strange he says this is not an action against the authorities, because what else would it be then? If you don't vote, there's a reason why you're not voting, right? So, yeah, that's a strange one to me.
I think, I feel maybe that I'm no expert in Iran, but I do get the impression that this isn't going the way that it was scripted by the regime completely. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens at the next round of voting.
They didn't put a helicopter crash in the script.
Jordan arrests prominent satirist facing jail over Facebook post. Jordanian security forces arrested famed satirical journalist Ahmed Hassan al-Zubi late on Tuesday as he was commuting with his wife and children, enacting a court order issued against him 11 months ago. There's a running joke that Jordan's a boring country. This is not boring. This is actually just quite concerning. Should we be concerned by this? Is Jordan changing for the worst?
I mean, I think we should always be concerned when we have freedom of expression being curtailed in such a way. I believe there was a famous case a couple of years ago where a woman was sentenced for insulting the king. I think she was later pardoned. But there's been a couple of these stories over the last couple of years.
I think it's slightly symptomatic of the monarchist-led nation, essentially. They like to have somewhat control over the press there as well. It's not known for its hugely free press or criticism of the monarchy.
No. Some great stuff on the New Arabs website this week. Nick, what have you brought for us?
Yeah, I've got why Dubai, Jeddah and Muscat are in desperate need of climate-proof investment. This is an interesting one because obviously Dubai was the location of the UN's COP climate change conference last year, and in 2022, the year prior, the event took place in Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh. So it's clear that this is an issue for the Middle East and North Africa as a region and for the world, but it's something that the region that we're concerned with particularly is going to have to seriously grapple with as we go forward into the future.
We spoke last week about the heat in Egypt. Rosabel.
I wanted to highlight an interesting article from the New Arab's former Lebanon correspondent William Christou called Inside the Telegraph's Discredited Beirut Airport Hezbollah Weapons Allegations, which looks further into an article published in the Daily Telegraph a few weeks ago that suggested that the Iran supported Lebanese group Hezbollah was storing advanced weaponry at Beirut International Airport, a civilian airport, which was a major allegation. There was some strange features to the article, like it didn't have a byline, and it was very much quoting whistleblowers from the airport. Parts of it were quickly sort of redacted. and the Lebanese government were very quick to deny the allegations as well, I should add. Anyway, William has got interviews with people who used to work with the Daily Telegraph, and it kind of explores where their Middle East content and coverage has diverged a bit in the last few years, and a bit of sort of insider criticism and knowledge, you could say.
Great piece that from Will. I picked out Egypt's evolving diplomatic approach to Sudan's war, so on the analysis section by El Fadil Ibrahim. This is a good look at Egypt's involvement with the ongoing very tragic war in Sudan and the people who are fleeing into Egypt to try and escape the violence. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we're joined by Nick McAlpin and Rosabel Crean. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly on Apple, Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts and be notified when a new episode drops. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. If you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com, that's podcast@newarab.com, or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. Don't forget to follow the New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.